Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as I give you an update on how my Montauk Daisy cuttings did. So let's go. Today is June 10th, and about 2 months ago, we took cuttings from one of my Montauk Daisies, which are also known as Nippon daisies. I made a video when we did that process together, and I'll be sure to put a link to that video down in the description below. Montauk Daisy is a plant that's pretty new in my garden. I noticed it in the big box stores a few years ago, and I was intrigued by it for the simple reason that they were selling it in the late summer months, and they were selling them along the same time that they were selling mums as well as asters. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think about fall time and when it comes to flowers, I definitely think about mums as well as asters, possibly even sunflowers. I really don't think about white colored daisies. That's what's neat about the Montauk Daisy, is that it's a perennial in zones 5 through 9, so it's hardy here where I live, and it provides a nice white pop of color in the late summer, early fall, when really I don't have a lot of other color in my yard. The perennial mums that I have in my landscape are either a purple color or a yellow color. And the asters that I have are also a purple color. So it's really nice to have the white daisy mixed in with those other colors. One of the drawbacks of Montauk Daisy is if you don't prune it regularly, it will get very tall, very leggy, and when it's blooming, it's just going to flop over. So you want to make sure you're maintaining your plant nicely throughout the season. It's generally recommended that you want to cut back or prune back your Montauk Daisy at least once during the season, typically when the plant is dormant or in the early spring months. And you want to either cut it back all the way down to the ground or 8 to 12 inches above the ground. And then optimally, you would prune it one more time later in the spring, early summer. And you want to usually do that definitely by middle of June. So it's a perfect time for me to be pruning these Montauk daisies back again. You don't want to prune them too late, because if you prune them too late, then you take the risk of your Montauk daisies not blooming during the current growing season. The first thing that I want to show you are my propagation results. 2 months ago, we took cuttings from the Montauk Daisy, and we could have discarded those cuttings when we pruned those daisies back. But I figured, why throw away the cuttings? I did some research and I found there are a couple of ways to propagate Montauk Daisy. One is by seed, another is by cuttings, and if you did the cuttings, you either could stick the cuttings in water or you could stick the cuttings in the ground or dirt. So I wanted to experiment. I took some cuttings, I put them in a vase of water, and then I also took some cuttings and I just put them in a pot this size, and I put a bunch of cuttings in this size pot. It's about a 4-inch pot. So I'm going to take you in for a closer look, and I'm going to show you the results of which method worked best for me. You can see that the cuttings look nice, lush, and green, so they definitely survived, but let's see whether or not they produced any roots for us. And before I show you that, I wanted to mention I was pretty good about watering these pots. Every so often I did forget. They dried out a little in between, but then I remembered and I watered them again. Also, I never put any sort of a humidity dome or a plastic wrap on top of these. And perhaps had I put a humidity dome over these, they might have rooted better. I'm not quite sure, but let's take a peek and see if we have any roots. Well, this is a good sign. I do see some roots, and that's a very nice looking cutting right there. You can see that it did form some pretty good roots at the bottom, which is promising. For this cutting here, you can see that even though there's growth at the top, there are no roots at the bottom here. The same is true for this one. And in case you're wondering what will I do with these, I don't want to throw them away because I feel like it could just be that they're going to take their sweet time with rooting. And at this point, I might just pot them up into their own individual 4-inch or 3-inch pots and put them down in my plant nursery and see if they make roots down there over time. All right, so now we have another one that does have roots on it. Now, keep in mind, I did check on these every so often. So possibly the ones that I pulled to check the roots on, maybe I disturbed them from their process. So that is something to keep in mind. I know I didn't pull all of them, but I did pull a few every so often just to check if there were roots being formed. Very nice. Here's another one that has roots on it, and another one that does not have roots. This one here, at first I didn't think there were any roots, but then I looked very carefully And it does appear it has roots just barely forming. So that shows me that the plants are going to root whenever they're ready to root. So don't give up hope. One reason I like to take a lot of cuttings, if I am going to take cuttings of a plant, is because not all plants are going to root. So out of 7 plants, 4 so far have rooted, 3 have not. I think that's a pretty good percentage right there. This pot right here doesn't look as good as the other pot in terms of the plants. Really only 2 plants look good, at least upon initial review of these. But let's go ahead and see if any of them formed roots. Again, another good sign. I do see some roots on the bottom here. This one looks pretty sad. I don't even think it's worth putting in its own pot. Maybe I'll stick it with another plant when I pot that one up. And it's quite possible that some of these dried out. They're just trying to recover. There are no roots on this one. The plant itself looks very healthy, and you can see that it has just a few roots, so it's just barely starting to root. Again, this cutting doesn't look very good. It probably got dried out, so it doesn't look great. And this cutting looks really good, at least from the top. And it also has a very small root. So we had 2 plants that rooted in that pot, and then 2, maybe 3 if you want to count that little one, that did not root. I think that's, again, a pretty good success rate. I'm very happy with that. And here are the plants that were rooted in water. You can see that they look pretty good when you look at them from the top. But when you look at the bottom, really only 1 has rooted. Now, was I great about changing the water every single day? Absolutely not. So I am going to be taking these, and I'm also going to be putting these into individual pots and see if they'll root inside of their own pots. I'm just going to use regular potting mix, and at this point, I just want to pot these up and put these plants down in my plant nursery. After I pot them up, I'll give them a good drink of water, and down there it is fairly shady, so they'll be well protected. And at this point, I just want the plants to keep growing. I want them to produce more roots with the intention that next spring I can plant these out in my landscape. I'm trying to be better about pruning plants back that need to be pruned, because if you don't prune certain plants back, like sedum or Montauk Daisy or perennial mums, then what happens is as the growing season goes on, those plants just keep getting taller and taller. And then they can't really support themselves as they get very tall and they start blooming. So it's really important to cut certain plants back, and you want to do it at the right time. And that is definitely true for Montauk Daisy. I've seen Montauk Daisy in the landscape around, this area where I live, and it can definitely look kind of ratty. So you don't want that. You want to have a beautiful, compact plant that's just really going to shine in the autumn months. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put one Montauk Daisy that has rooted, and I'm going to stick in a Montauk Daisy that did not root into that pot. And if that other plant does root, that's great. And if it doesn't, then I really didn't lose anything. I'd love to know if you grow the Montauk Daisy. And if so, do you prune your Montauk Daisy back? And I challenge you, if you don't grow the Montauk Daisy and you think you want to have it in your yard, to look around for it this late summer, early fall, or even ask your local garden center if they plan on carrying it. Since I have a backyard plant nursery, I often get that question about plants and trying to basically have plants blooming at different times of the season. And it does seem like as we get into the late summer, early fall, it's hard to find plants that are going to look pretty in the fall time, which is why I love making videos on the Montauk Daisy, because I really feel like it's a plant that a lot of people haven't heard of. I'm going to go ahead and give these guys a good drink of water. And then again, these will get placed down in my backyard plant nursery where they'll get a lot more shade just to recover from the transplant shock. So when it comes to the plants that were in the vase with the water, you can see again, they look really good, very healthy from the top. They just didn't produce the roots that we were looking for. I don't want to throw these away. Instead, I want to keep them and I just want to pot them up, leave them down in my plant nursery. I'll forget about them. Of course, if it doesn't rain and if they don't get water, I'll water them. Otherwise, I just want to see if they will keep on growing and if they'll produce better roots for us. And of course, I'll give you an update in future videos, just in case you're curious. One thing that I did bring are my hand pruners. And what I'm thinking of doing is just cutting these back a little bit so that they are not so top heavy in these little small 4-inch pots. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm noticing that there's just like this extra long piece coming off on the side here. I might as well cut it off. I really want the plant to put its energy into creating roots at this point. And what the heck, I might as well take this piece right here and stick it in the dirt. You never know. For the one that did root, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the root on there, but I'm going to cut this at the top by a little bit, just so, again, it's not such a long, big piece. So again, these are the cuttings that were in the soil, and they were originally in 2 pots. We divided them up, and they're now divided into 5 pots. And then these were the cuttings that were in the water, and we also were able to put a few cuttings in each pot. So when it comes to these plants, my goal is, again, to hopefully have them root more in these individual pots. I'll check them later in the summer, and if I find that they are outgrowing their pots, at that time I can pot them up. I want them to be comfortable as we head into the winter months so that they're ready to plant out in the landscape next spring. Now let's go to the west side of my house, which is my front yard, and I'll show you where the Montauk daisies are out in my landscape. Here we are in the front of my house, and you can see there are a bunch of things that are either blooming right now or will be blooming pretty soon. But remember, Montauk Daisy is for later in the season. We have some Stella d'Oro daylily that are right here. Just behind that are where the Montauk Daisy are hiding. Let me show you. I have one Montauk Daisy there. I have another one over there. We have a third one over here, and then we have another smaller one tucked in right next to it on the other side. A lot of times when I think of perennials, I think of kind of a smallish plant, but you can see like the size of this Montauk daisy is almost like a little shrub. It's really neat. It's pretty big compared to in the spring when I showed you how to take cuttings from it and basically how to control its size. That's why it's important to cut it back one more time right now. And the rule of thumb is you don't want to cut it back too late. So right now it's the middle of June, so it's a perfect time for me here in New Hampshire Zone 5B for me to go ahead and cut this back. You usually want to cut it back about 8 to 12 inches from the ground. And if I had to guess, this plant is already right now about 12 inches. So you could argue, well, then why am I cutting it back? I just worry that it's going to get too top heavy and flop over. I would rather cut it back a little bit more, maybe bring it down to 8 inches, somewhere in that ballpark. You know, it's an estimate. Just to be able to control the size of this plant. And if you were a little nervous about this process, by all means, you don't have to cut back the whole thing. You could selectively prune like every other piece if you wanted to do that. When we prune this back, this will actually set back the plant from blooming by at least 2 to 3 weeks. So that is something to keep in mind. Another thing you could do is you could selectively prune just kind of the outside of the plant so that that's shorter, and maybe that can hold in the taller pieces that are in the middle. You can definitely play around with it. But my plan for this year is to cut every single piece on each of the Montauk daisies, and I'm only going to cut them back by about 3 inches or so, 4 max, because I don't want to take off too much because really this plant is fairly new in my landscape. So I'm going to take you in for a closer look and just show you my process for pruning the Montauk Daisy. As always, whenever you're using any sort of cutting instrument or pruning shears, make sure that they're sanitized. You don't want to be having disease spread from one plant to another. And when I make my cut, I want to just make sure I'm making it just above a leaf node. So there's one cutting. I could definitely throw this away, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the bottom leaves. And you can see I stripped off all the leaves except a few of them. You don't want to have too many leaves on there. And I'm literally just going to make a hole in the ground here and stick this cutting in the hole. I've never done this, but I have seen that you can try this method as well. And when you think about it, it's no different than sticking this in a pot. I do have drip irrigation right here, so I know that this cutting will be receiving water. If you were to stick a cutting just like that in the ground and you don't have drip irrigation, then you want to make sure you're watering that cutting regularly. And that's it. And that's what I plan on doing with all of my Montauk Daisy, are just cutting them back by about 3 or 4 inches, stripping off the bottom leaves, and then taking each of those individual cuttings and just placing the cuttings at the base of each of these Montauk Daisy plants. And then next year, I'll have lots of baby plants around the base that I can take and move around my garden. I really hope you enjoyed this short instructional video. As always, if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear from you. Please drop them in the comment section below. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.